repeal rather than continue to work to make that bill even better than it was when we...
And you can follow this online at cspan.org. The House is gaveling back in for procedural votes on 2014 defense spending. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
312, if ordered. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 312, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
Resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2397, making appropriations for the Department of Defense for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes, and providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2610, making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes.
The question is on ordering the previous question. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
Before that brief recess, the House had been debating the rule for consideration of two 2014 spending bills, defense and transportation and HUD. On defense, if the rule is passed, that will allow for an hour of general debate and consideration of 100 amendments. This is a vote on the previous question. Democrats, as we'll show you in a bit of floor debate coming up momentarily, have been urging the Speaker to appoint conferees to negotiate a fiscal year 2014 budget resolution. So previous question vote here, it's 15 minutes, and then the rule vote for covering both defense and transportation HUD for fiscal year 2014. On defense, we got an update on the bill from a Capitol Hill reporter.
The biggest fight so far has been over amendments on the National Security Agency's surveillance program. Congressman Justin Amash, a Libertarian Republican, has put forward an amendment that would basically defund the NSA programs if they don't specifically limit information on those who aren't under investigation. His amendment would significantly curtail what the NSA's spying activities currently are, at least what we've learned, and it has been quite controversial. The House Republican leaders basically delayed this bill for a week as they were trying to figure out whether or not they wanted to give Congressman Amash a vote. They decided on Monday that they would allow his amendment to receive a vote.
What about amendments dealing with U.S. aid to Egypt and Syria?
Yeah, those are the other two controversial packages, and I think those are kind of all being left for the end of this bill. There were, I believe, 9 amendments offered that would restrict either military aid or military action in Syria without specific congressional approval. The House is going to vote on one of those amendments later on during the bill. There's also an amendment that would limit aid to Egypt without specific congressional approval. And this is kind of, it's a pushback. The administration has said that it's going to arm the Syrian rebels, provide military aid, that was approved after some delay by the Congressional Intelligence Committees. And this would broaden it out and require the entire Congress to approve the aid rather than just the intelligence panels.
Does the inclusion of the debate on these amendments, Egypt and Syria and NSA, will that be enough to satisfy the sponsors? Will be enough to secure passage of the entire bill when that happens later this week?
It looks like it will. You know, there was talk from Congressman Amash and some of his Libertarian members that they were going to try, you know, to stop debate, to defeat the rule, and they dropped that after they got votes on their amendments. It's going to be interesting because this is really the first time that we're seeing Congress weigh in on the NSA spying programs since they were revealed in the Guardian stories 2 months ago.
On the NSA amendment in particular, where are Democrats?
That is the question. Steny Hoyer wouldn't say kind of his thoughts on it when he was asked about it on Tuesday. You have liberal Democrats who are joining with the Libertarian Republicans in opposition to this, but some of the more moderate Democrats, particularly, you know, members of the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, you know, they're still weighing. There was a briefing today, there was a briefing on Tuesday that with General Alexander, the director of the NSA, so he could address their questions on the NSA's program.
The administration has issued a veto threat. What's their objection? And secondly, how does the spending level for this bill this year, 2014, compare with years past?
Yeah, this bill is it authorizes about $600 billion in defense spending, including the base Pentagon budget and also the overseas contingency operations for the war in Afghanistan. It's below last year's levels, but it is above the pre-sequester levels of spending that have been, set in the Budget Control Act of 2011. The veto threat is over that in that the House Budget Committee has approved a budget that cuts discretionary spending down to sequester levels. It doesn't do it for defense, it does it for all the other agencies, and the administration objects to that approach. I think the bill is going to pass, and it doesn't seem like the veto threat would be followed through on, but it's certainly going to be the fight over the appropriations bills going forward.
Where's the Senate bill, defense bill, stand right now?
The Senate Defense Appropriations Committee has not yet marked up their bill. They are expected to do that later this month, and then it's a question of when that goes to the floor, which is still to be determined.
Jeremy Herb writes for The Hill, covering defense debate, defense spending bill debate in the House, and you can follow his writing at thehill.com. Thanks for that update.
Thank you.
And we'll have a vote on the rule for that defense spending bill coming up next in this series of 2 votes. This is a previous question vote, as Democrats once again trying to make the issue of 2014 budget known to the Speaker. They're calling for the Speaker to appoint conferees to negotiate a 2014 budget resolution. We'll hear a bit about that in the upcoming debate that we're going to bring to you during the remainder of this vote. We'll hear from the managers of the rule debate on defense spending, and also hear from Steny Hoyer of Maryland.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Massachusetts, and I want at the outset to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. McGovern and Mr. Welch regarding the importance of this body having a debate and a vote on whether or not we should be sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to engage and support the rebels in the civil war in Syria. After all, this budget supports the Defense Department. It also supports the intelligence agency. So this is the time and place to have the debate about taxpayer dollars going into a civil war in Syria. It's also the time and high time that we get on with passing a federal budget. We've heard a lot of talk on the floor today about the importance of supporting our military. Absolutely true. But this legislation does nothing to turn off the sequester. So unless the Congress comes together on a bipartisan and bicameral basis to resolve the budget, this defense appropriations bill is going to be cut by about $48 billion, just as the non-defense parts of the budget will be cut as a result of sequestration. So I don't think the American people recognize that as of today, even though we're working on these spending bills, the United States Congress has not passed a budget. No federal budget in place today. Now, we heard a lot from our Republican colleagues over the last couple of years about how the Senate was derelict in its duty for not having a budget. Guess what? The Senate passed a budget. It passed a budget 122 days ago. Ever since that time, we've said to our Republican colleagues, let's take the next step in the process. Let's have a conference. Senate, House, get together to work out those differences. In fact, Senator Murray, who's the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, has asked now 17 times for unanimous consent in the Senate to begin negotiations. We have called upon the Speaker of the House to appoint conferees to negotiate on the budget. He has refused. This motion is very simple. I'm just going to read the resolve clause. It's the sense of the House of Representatives that the Speaker should follow regular House procedure and immediately request a conference and appoint conferees to negotiate the fiscal year 2014 budget resolution. Very simple. Calling for exactly what our Republican colleagues have called for the last 3 years. We heard from you many times, no budget, no pay. We don't have a budget. Members of Congress are getting paid. Now, Senator McCain and a lot of Republican senators have made the point that it's insane to not go to conference on the budget. Here's what he said, Senator McCain. I think it's insane for Republicans who complained for 4 years about Harry Reid not having a budget, and now we're not going to agree to conferees, that is beyond comprehension for me. That sentiment was seconded by lots of other Republican senators. In fact, I think my colleagues know I've heard from a lot of our House Republican colleagues quietly saying they're frankly embarrassed at the fact that the House Republicans have refused to appoint conferees and take the next step in the budget process. Why is it important? We got to get our economy moving in full gear. The Congressional Budget Office has told us that as a result of the sequester, we're going to have 700,000 fewer jobs in this country by the end of this calendar year, that it's going to reduce our economic growth by 1/3. The budget conference is where we work out our differences and try and remove the uncertainty in the economy. By not going to budget conference, let's be clear, what our Republican colleagues are doing, they want to take us right up to the cliff of government shutdown in the beginning of October, next fiscal year. They're talking about once again rolling the dice and playing a game of chicken as to whether or not the United States pays its bills on time. That is no way for the federal government to conduct itself. So I would ask my colleagues to put aside all the gamesmanship and simply today appoint conferees so that we can begin to work out these issues on the budget. Right now, as we head into the next school year, the kids of our soldiers who are at Fort Bragg are going to miss 5 days of school this fall because their teachers are sequestered. Their pay is because of the sequester, they're going to be furloughed for 5 days this fall. These are the kids of men and women fighting to defend this country. That is wrong. So let's get on with replacing the sequester in a smart way, but you can't do that unless we get on with the budget conference. So I ask my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can go to conference. I thank the Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's always great to hear from Mr. Van Hollen. He's been in front of the Rules Committee, I think, half a dozen times on this particular issue. But that's not the issue we're talking about today. Today we're talking about a rule to bring forward two bills, and one is the appropriations bill for the defense of this country. I appreciate his comments, but, you know, he also forgets to mention that in the last Congress, this House passed two pieces of legislation to actually do what he was talking about doing. And guess what? It went over to that place where they have rocking chairs where they do nothing. And they didn't discuss it, didn't debate it, didn't even send it back to us because they just didn't have the time to do it in their busy schedule. So I understand that. So I would be glad to yield just 30 seconds.
All right, just for a look, okay. As the gentleman knows, we're in a new Congress right now. And in the new Congress, the law requires that we pass a federal budget by April 15th. We're obviously way overdue. It's indisputed that the Senate's passed a budget. Why not go to conference?
Reclaiming my time, I mean, you know, you brought up about shutting the government down. That's your words, not ours. I don't think you've heard that at all from this side. You know, about not shutting the government down, it's about passing 12 appropriation bills. That's really what we're supposed to be doing, and we're committed to doing that. We don't want to see a government shutdown. That is the last thing, and I think by our intentions about bringing appropriation bills to this House shows, in fact, that that's not the intent, and that's not the desire. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to build on what my colleague, Mr. Van Hollen, was talking about, the reason why we're so frustrated over here is because it seems that the Republican leadership here is hell-bent on doing nothing, stopping everything. We have 16 legislative days left till the end of the fiscal year. You've only passed 3 appropriations bills. No conference on the budget, notwithstanding the fact that the House passed the budget, the Senate passed the budget. We have a debt limit looming, which I hear rumors that you're trying to figure out, you know, what pound of flesh that you can obtain in order to avoid us defaulting on our financial obligations. This is not the way to run a government. And I would just plead with my colleagues on the other side that you need to get serious about sitting down and negotiating out differences. One of the things about a conference is you don't get everything you want, and they don't get everything they want. But these appropriations bills that you are bringing to the floor, the allocations are so low that that they're unamendable on the House floor, and they would do great damage to our economy. This T-HUD bill, which I don't think will ever see the light of day, any more than I think the Ag-Approps bill, which we gave a rule to, will ever see the light of day. But that T-HUD bill, the cuts in the community development block grants, you have the program. You cut it in half. The devastation on cities all across this country, and communities all across this country, will be so bad. People are going to lose jobs. The gentleman from Maryland talked about the furloughs. People losing their jobs because of the sequester. And you sit back and say, oh, it's not our fault. This is the body that voted for it. I mean, the people in this House voted for, I didn't, but a majority of my friends on the other side voted for sequester. It is now the law of the land. That's part of what Congress did. Congress has to change the law so we get our economy back on the right track. And one way to begin is to do what you're supposed to do and go to conference with the Senate on the budget. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Chair to remind all members of the House the central rule of decorum in the House. Under Clause 1 of Rule 17, members are to direct their remarks to the Chair and not to other members in the second person. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I reserve.
Florida reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
May I ask the gentleman how many more speakers he has?
I have none.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 3.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Florida has 16 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have a problem with what's in this rule. I have a problem with what's been left out of the rule. We have some serious issues to discuss. The NSA surveillance program, limited debate in this rule. We need to talk about Syria, whether we're going to get sucked into another war. Multiple amendments were offered. All of them were denied except one that basically reinstates current law. There are issues about Egypt that ought to be discussed on the floor. And when I hear my colleagues say, oh, these are sensitive issues, we shouldn't talk about them on the floor, then where should we talk about them? This is the appropriate bill to talk about those things, and yet many of these amendments were not made in order. That's why an open rule would have been more appropriate. And in terms of debate, I don't know why we have to limit debate on issues like the national security on the NSA down to 15 minutes apiece. Everybody's concerned about this. And again, I will just close, Mr. Speaker, by again urging my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question, so that we can offer an amendment to allow Mr. Van Hollen's language to be made in order, that the Republican leadership agreed to go to a conference with the Senate over the budget. This sequester and these budget numbers that you are bringing to the floor on these various appropriations bills are destructive. You are hurting this. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hurting this economy. This gamesmanship that my friends on the other side are playing is doing great damage to this country. We have to stop this. We have to be grown-ups here and do what we're supposed to do. And the most important thing that can happen right now, given the fact that there's only 16 legislative days left to the end of this fiscal year, is for my friends on the other side of the aisle to go to conference on the budget and work out a deal so that we don't have these devastating cuts that will impact every city and town in this country, that will throw tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people out of work, that will do further damage to our infrastructure. You know, national security means the quality of life that people have here in the United States. You know, it means about whether they can have good health care and good education, whether they have good roads and safe roads to drive on. It means whether they have a job. National security begins right here at home. And the numbers that my Republican friends have been bringing to the floor in terms of allocations for these appropriations bills on domestic spending would be devastating to this economy. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question, and I urge a no vote on this rule. We should have an open rule where we can talk about all these major issues that are confronting our nation and the world. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time.
debate from earlier today, ostensibly on the rule for the defense spending bill, the transportation spending bill, but as you heard, largely on the 2014 budget. The previous question vote here, Democrats are calling on their members to vote no on the previous question so they can bring up Chris Van Hollen's resolution, a resolution expressing the sense of the House that the Speaker should follow regular order and request a conference and appoint conferees to negotiate a fiscal year 2014 budget resolution with the Senate. This has been a 15-minute vote. The vote on the rule for defense and transportation, the spending bills for 2014, will happen next. That'll be a 5-minute vote. If the rule passes, the House will move on to general debate on defense spending and then consideration of 100 amendments. On transportation spending, the Senate earlier today voted to invoke cloture to end debate on the motion to proceed to the transportation spending bill. And we expect that when the Senate, that vote was 73 to 26, by the way, we expect that when the Senate returns to debate this afternoon in about 15 minutes, they will begin work on the actual transportation spending bill. Of course, you can follow the Senate on C-SPAN 2. Also today, we are covering on Capitol Hill the House Judiciary Committee. They'll be gaveling in shortly, and you can follow this over on C-SPAN 3. They're holding a hearing to consider how to deal with children who were brought to the U.S. illegally. President Obama last year issued an executive order allowing hundreds of thousands of so-called dreamers to stay in the country. The order came after a bill called the DREAM Act was defeated in the previous Congress. We will have live coverage of that House Judiciary Committee hearing over on C-SPAN 3. And again, it's set to get underway right about now. Probably will get underway once these votes wrap up.
On this vote, the yeas are 229, the nays are 190. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion chair, the ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise, a sufficient number having risen. A recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
And provided the House passes the rule for defense spending and transportation spending bill consideration, the House will begin general debate on that 2014 defense spending bill, and then consideration of some 100 amendments that include those that would block military aid to Syrian rebels and to the Egyptian military, and much later in the consideration of amendments, an amendment by Justin Amash of Michigan, which would end the authority for the blanket collection of records under the Patriot Act. The amendment would bar the NSA and other agencies from using Section 215 of the Patriot Act to collect records, including telephone calls and records pertaining to people who aren't subject to an investigation. But that amendment consideration expected much later in the debate. On that amendment, Senators Feinstein and Chambliss of the Intelligence Committee released a joint statement earlier today saying that the FISA business records program has contributed to disrupting numerous terrorist attacks against our nation. They say that, quote, "We believe this debate in the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committee should continue, and that any amendments to defund the program on appropriations bills would be unwise." Another view, though, from a member of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Wyden, he spoke earlier today at the Center for American Progress. Here's what he had to say about the proposal in the House on NSA.
But the fact that this has made it to the floor of the House of Representatives is unquestionably good. It is another step, as I've outlined, in the march to a real debate. We wouldn't have had that 7-8 weeks ago. We would have been, as I tried to outline this morning, just chipping away day after day trying to make our case. And now, as of what I read late last night, this debate is going to be on the floor of the House of Representatives. And later today, we're going to see members of Congress start debating the real issues. I mean, I assume very early on they're going to start a discussion about what I call the false choice, where you can either have your security or your liberty. And as you heard me describe, probably in root canal-like detail, I don't think that's the case. I think when elected officials do their job, we can have both. So the fact that this is on the floor of the House of Representatives later today is unquestionably very good for the cause that we're outlining today.
Senator Ron Wyden, earlier today at the Center for American Progress. You can see all of his comments later in our program schedule and anytime you want online at cspan.org. On the floor of the House, they're voting on the rule for the consideration of two 2014 spending bills, transportation and defense. And we expect if the rule passes, they will move on next to general debate on that defense spending bill and then on to consideration of the 100 amendments or so. Off the floor of the House today, the Judiciary Committee will be gaveling in shortly to take up a hearing looking at immigration, in particular how to deal with children who were brought into the U.S. illegally, the so-called dreamers, and that will get underway shortly, probably after this vote. And you can follow that live once it starts on C-SPAN 3.
126, the nays are 194. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I present a privileged report for printing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany H.R. 2787, a bill making appropriations for the Departments of Commerce and Justice, Science and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes.
Referred to Union Calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 21, points of order are reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I present a privileged report for printing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany H.R. 2786, a bill making appropriations for financial services and general government for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes.
Referred to Union Calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 21, points of order are reserved. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I may hereafter be considered to be the first sponsor of H.R. 1012, a bill originally introduced by Representative Markey of Massachusetts for the purposes of adding co-sponsors and requesting reprintings pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 12.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the consideration of H.R. 2397, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 312 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2397. The Chair appoints the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Miller, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2397, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Department of Defense for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Young, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Visklosky, will each control 30 minutes, and the Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, the subcommittee has produced this bill after months of bipartisan cooperation, months of hearings, and months of classified briefings. And we present a bill today that is $512 billion, $3.4 billion below the CBO estimate of the President's request, and approximately $28.1 billion above the estimated fiscal year 2013 sequestration level. For overseas contingency operations, OCO, the bill includes $85.8 billion, which is $1.5 billion below last year's level. We have worked closely with all parties. Mr. Visklosky has been involved in every step of the way on producing this legislation. Our committee staff is unequaled anywhere in this Congress, and they have done a tremendous job for the subcommittee. So just some highlights of the bill. There's $580 million to fully fund the authorized military pay raise, $36 million to fully fund the anticipated fuel costs, $950 million to fully fund the second Virginia-class submarine, $922 million to restore facility sustainment, modernization, and restoration funding, and $692 million for military medical research, including $246 million for cancer research and $125 million for traumatic brain injury. During the next couple of days, we are going to consider 100 amendments. So everybody be prepared. It's going to be a long day and a long night. And so, Madam Chair, to get us started off on the right track, I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Indiana.
Madam Chair, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would like to begin by expressing my appreciation to Chairman Young and to congratulate him on the bipartisan and transparent manner in which he has crafted the fiscal year 2014 defense bill. I also want to express my gratitude to Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, and all of the members of the Defense Subcommittee for their efforts. We would not be here today but for their outstanding effort. Would also note that this will be the last defense appropriation bill we bring to the floor with the membership of Mr. Bonner from Alabama. With his leaving this institution, we are losing a very serious and thoughtful member who has worked assiduously every day to leave the world better, and certainly want to recognize his individual contribution. The bill also could not have been written without the dedication, hard work, and sound judgment of the staff that Mr. Young has already referenced. I do want to thank Tom McLemore, Sherry Young, Tim Prince, Jennifer Miller, Walter Hearn, Paul Terry, B.G. Wright, Brooke Boyer, Ann Reese, Andrea Ramsey, Megan Rosenbush, Maureen Holohan, Paul Jola, Rebecca Legere, Kent Clark, Michael Rigney, and Joe DeVoe. The bill at hand is fundamentally aimed at restoring readiness and training for the services, two areas that have suffered greatly in the budgetary upset of the current year. While Chairman Young has noted that the bill's $212 billion in funding is approximately $28 billion more than in fiscal year 2013 post-sequestration, it does contain a number of significant reductions. The bill cuts $617.8 million from the Joint Strike Fighter program to address unjustified cost growth and unjustified concurrency estimates for the program. It cuts another $112 million due to an overstatement of Army travel requirement. The bill rescinds $443 million for C-27J aircraft. The bill and report contain a significant amount of language and robust funding for initiatives to respond to sexual assault in the armed services. Sexual assault in any circumstance is unacceptable and maddening. The fact that it is prevalent within the military is even more so because of the standard to which our men and women in uniform hold themselves. These are individuals who are committed to give their last full measure of devotion to our nation, who in order to be effective need to unconditionally trust each other. Sexual assault undermines all of this. Though I strongly support the efforts contained in this bill, they are aimed mainly at offender accountability and caring for victims. Even though the comprehensive solution to this issue lies outside the services, it is imperative that the proper attitudes and training start during the recruitment process for the officers and enlisted and continue throughout each service member's career. I would also note that the bill includes $20 million above the request for suicide prevention and outreach consistent with the funding level of the past 2 years. Suicides are another disheartening problem within the services, especially given the emphasis that the Department and Congress have placed on the issue over the past few years. But money is not the only solution. We need to spend the appropriated dollars as wisely and effectively as possible. I was taken aback in a hearing earlier this year to learn that the Navy has a collection of 123 programs aimed at addressing suicide and resiliency. While I'm sure that each one of these programs is well-intentioned, the sheer number spreads resources too thin and creates confusion. To their credit, the Navy is in the process of implementing task force recommendations to dedicate more resources to the programs that truly work. Additionally, I would like to express my support for a solution that benefits all future users of the Integrated Electronic Health Record Program. I am proud of the efforts of our subcommittee and the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee to effectuate this long-awaited improvement to medical care for our still serving military members and our veterans. Additionally, the cooperation between our subcommittees and with our corresponding authorization committees demonstrates the importance Congress places on the issue. I am pleased that the bill report contains provisions that enhance oversight at the Department. The Office of the Inspector General is funded at $347 million, which is nearly $35 million above the administration's request. This office plays a vital role in moving the Department towards audible financial statements, which are long overdue and which I attach a great importance to. Also, while the committee increased funding relative to the budget request for environmental cleanup at formerly used defense sites, this increase is accompanied by additional reporting requirements. In the same vein as my prior comments, the money in this program must be spent more effectively going forward to ensure that we complete cleanup projects, not just continue them. Regarding missile defense, the bill increases advanced procurement funding for additional ground-based interceptors. This funding is accompanied by a requirement to document the adequacy of the testing plan for the ground-based interceptors. In light of the program's recent test failure, I continue to be very concerned about the concurrency of this program. I believe it is essential to maintain rigorous standards to ensure that the weapons we pursue are fully developed before we begin fielding them, and once fielded, that these weapons effectively perform their missions. Further, we should review to determine the cause of the latest test failure and understand that if this program needs to be changed, we should reevaluate our position in conference. While I support the bill, there are a few provisions that I have concerns with. In particular, the three general provisions regarding detainees at Guantanamo Bay. I believe that the continued operation of Guantanamo Bay reduces our nation's credibility and weakens our national security by providing terrorist organizations with recruitment material. I do regret that this bill and other relevant appropriation bills continues to thwart any attempts to close Guantanamo by prohibiting viable alternatives. Further, I am concerned that the bill essentially prohibits a pay raise for civilian employees at the Department of Defense. We rely on the Department of Defense civilians working side by side with our military personnel to provide medical care for our troops, to perform vital logistics, maintenance and acquisition services, and to provide many other essential services within the Department. Even a modest raise that maintains pay equity between civilian and military personnel sends a critical message of support to these employees. And looking ahead, I am concerned that if the shadows of the future remain unaltered, we will experience serious problems ensuring the continued defense of our nation. As Todd Harrison at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments has noted, rather than getting larger and more expensive over the past decade, the military has simply grown more expensive. This reality makes our future choices even more difficult, and it is imperative that Congress joins with the Department in working through these decisions at arm's length and also as a partner. The Department of Defense did recommend some very difficult reductions in the budget submitted to us earlier this year, as they have done in previous years. And we as legislators can no longer afford to reflexively reject those recommendations because they affect a specific company, a specific region of the country, or are simply not the most politic of choices to be made. Our military is at a familiar crossroad, one they have been at before as the end of combat operations near. The additions and subtractions to defense funding made today must be carried out with an eye to the future, with a sense of the strategic impact on America's future ability to muster a force capable of successfully defending and protecting our country. In closing, I again want to reiterate my appreciation to Chairman Young for his cooperation and assistance in addressing the interests we have expressed. He and his staff have ensured that the subcommittee continues its long tradition of operating collaboratively and effectively and transparently. I am pleased that we are finally considering this bill on the floor and look forward to the debate. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, first I would like to thank Mr. Visklosky for his much more detailed description of this legislation. And I would now yield to the chairman of the full committee on appropriations, who has strongly committed to making sure that we pass all of our appropriations bills, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Gentleman from Tennessee recognized for 5 minutes. Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Big difference. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding this time. And of course, I rise in support of this, the DOD appropriations bill. The bill provides more than $512 billion in base funding for our national security and military efforts, and $85.8 billion in overseas contingency operations war funding. This is a base funding decrease of $5.1 billion below fiscal 13, but is about $28.1 billion above the current level caused by automatic sequestration spending cuts. This total reflects an appropriate, thorough analysis of what is needed to keep this country safe. Freedom isn't free. Our liberties, our rights, our property are preserved by our national defense, but at a cost. Sufficient funding for the Pentagon and our military is of the utmost importance to the continued prosperity of the United States of America. It is and should be our top priority. We've already seen the distressing toll that the heavy-handed, indiscriminate cuts of sequestration have taken on our military, from grounded planes to reduced training time to postponed maintenance, all of which contribute to the loss of readiness of our troops. And as we saw all this month, as Department of Defense civilian furloughs began, our economy is also taking a significant hit. The funding level in this bill strikes a balance between fiscal responsibility and sufficient support for our military. Within this total, we prioritize funding to advance our missions abroad, to prepare and equip our troops, and to ensure the readiness and effectiveness of our military. This includes adequate funding to purchase the equipment, weapons, and vehicles needed to keep our military protected at the ready and able to conduct successful operations. The bill also provides funding for ongoing operations and maintenance of military facilities, equipment, and bases fundamental to the successful missions of our armed forces. And essential funding is provided to develop new defense technologies, to advance the success of current military operations, and to plan for whatever new threats may arise in the future. A well-equipped military is not as effective without strong and well-prepared troops. This funding supports readiness programs that prepare our troops for both combat and peacetime missions, giving them flight time and battle training. In addition, the bill funds the authorized 1.8% pay raise for the military, above the 1% the President requested. To keep our troops healthy before and after battle, the Defense Health Program receives an increase above last year's level, funding medical facility upgrades, traumatic brain injury, and psychological health research, and suicide prevention outreach. The bill also addresses what has been a black mark on our military, Madam Chairman, the problem with sexual assault. The legislation fully funds sexual assault prevention and response programs and adds $25 million in funding for sexual assault victim assistance to preserve trust in our military and ensure that members of our armed forces are not sacrificing more than they already have to serve the nation. But a balanced budget, one that does not put us into massive debt to other governments or threaten our economic stability, is also paramount to our national security. Even these critical national security programs cannot spend precious tax dollars unchecked. The bill has implemented common sense reductions wherever possible, including rescinding unused prior year funding, nixing a proposed civilian pay raise, and saving $1 billion in anticipated excess funding. We've also prohibited funding to modify facilities in the U.S. to house Guantanamo detainees or to allow their transfer into the U.S. or its territories. When all is said and done, this bill cuts more than $5 billion below last year's enacted level, but I must emphasize that these reductions will in no way harm or negatively affect our national defense or the troops that fight to protect this great country. Madam Chairman, some will complain that the bill breaks the cap placed on defense spending under the sequester level for fiscal year 2014, put into place by the Budget Control Act. To this I say, of course it does. Mr. Chairman, I ask for an additional minute.
Yes, sir. How much?
Gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
Gentleman, additional 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
Of course it does. This massive, irresponsible, dangerous reduction to defense spending under the sequestration cap is completely beyond the pale. For example, if nothing is done to cancel the next round of sequestration cuts that are scheduled to take effect when the Congress adjourns, this bill would be cut to a total of $468 billion. So, before I close, Madam Chairman, I'd like to take this time to thank the venerable chairman of this committee, of this subcommittee, Bill Young. He's a national asset, and he has shown again the skill that he has in putting together a great bill. And to Mr. Visklosky, thank you for being a great partner to our chairman throughout this process. And to the staff and the entire subcommittee members, without your hard work, we would not have this bill on the floor. I salute you and endorse this bill wholeheartedly. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
I would yield such time as she may consume to the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Lowy.
Gentlelady from New York, recognized for as much time as she may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Chairman Young, Ranking Member Visklosky, Chairman Rogers for working across the aisle on the bill before us today in keeping with the Defense Subcommittee's long bipartisan tradition. I also want to recognize and thank the Defense Subcommittee staff for working tirelessly on the nuts and bolts of this bill. Sadly, however, the appropriations process has become a quandary that could easily have been avoided with good old-fashioned compromise. Instead, we have disparate House and Senate allocations. House bills follow the Ryan budget, which endorses sequestration, is unrealistic, unworkable, and economically misguided, while the Senate and White House budgets are based on the higher level agreed upon in the Budget Control Act. With only 18 days of session left in the House before the end of the fiscal year, we are racing toward a government shutdown that is irresponsible. Assuming the sequester is turned off, this is a good bill. It includes additional funding and tougher penalties to address the epidemic of sexual assault plaguing our military, an increase for active duty pay by 1.8%, enhancements to embassy security by increasing the presence of Marine Corps security guards, substantial investments in health services and suicide prevention, maintenance of all the National Guard weapons of mass destruction, civil support teams, and continued support for the Israeli Cooperative Program. However, the bill also contains serious shortcomings. On July 8th, I was at Camp Smith in my district in New York, where 48 of the more than 600,000 defense civilian employees nationwide are being furloughed. Each will lose $2,706, 20% reduction to their fourth quarter earnings, on top of 3 years without a pay increase. Yet this bill does nothing to fix the pay freeze or furloughs resulting from the sequester. In fact, the majority simply ignores sequestration when it suits their purpose, including in the spending allocations for Milcon VA, Homeland Security, and defense bills, while the Republicans are steadfast in sticking to the post-sequester overall discretionary allocation they included in the Ryan budget. They are comfortable breaking the Budget Control Act's cap on defense spending by $47.7 billion. Of course, they may not tell you that unless we end the sequester on January 15th, those funds will be lost, creating a gaping hole in the defense budget. And they don't have the courage of their convictions to admit that breaking the defense cap further shortchanges vital domestic priorities like medical research, Head Start, teachers for military families, energy efficiency, disaster preparedness, and other vital investments, all of which create jobs. We have already achieved $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction since 2011, including $1.5 trillion in discretionary cuts. It's time for Congress to buckle down to reach a bipartisan agreement to replace sequestration with a balanced approach that protects critical services and investments. As I did for Milcon VA and Homeland Security, I support the overall funding level in defense because it was written as though Congress will turn off sequestration, as we should. But on the remaining bills, as with the energy and water bill, I will not support slashing investments in our families and workforce. If we are to remain a global leader, we need a strong national defense and a strong economy. I thank you again to the chairman and the ranking member who have worked so hard in a bipartisan way, maintaining the tradition of this committee. And as we move forward, I do hope that we can go to conference and work together with the Senate to come up with a bill that can really pass and sequestration be eliminated. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida.